Honestly, it's been a while since we've done a video about Lovecraft. And it feels weird saying that, because if you've been here since the beginning, you know this is where the channel actually started, with the mythos, with those impossible entities, with that kind of horror that doesn't just scare you, it makes you feel small, insignificant, like reality itself is some kind of sick joke. I guess over the past months I've been diving more into other stuff, science fiction, cosmic horror, disturbing theories about the universe. But if we're being honest, all of that comes from the same place. Because what Lovecraft did, and I genuinely believe this, was plant the seed for everything. The idea that real horror isn't hiding under your bed, or in some haunted graveyard. Real horror is out there, or worse, in places we can't even begin to imagine. So, today, we're going back to where it all started, back to the most terrifying entities in the Lovecraftian universe. But we're not just doing some basic list. Number. Today we're digging into the hidden lore, the secrets, the stuff nobody really talks about, the little details that, once you connect them, make you realize this entire universe is way more disturbing than it looks on the surface. Let's dive into the abyss. The Hounds of Tindalos are, without exaggeration, one of the most terrifying entities ever conceived within the expanded Cthulhu mythos. And it's not because of what they do, it's because of where they come from. These beings don't originate from another planet, another galaxy, or even another dimension as we typically understand it. They inhabit what occult mathematics refers to as the angular hyperspace, a non-Euclidean realm made entirely of angles, where the basic concepts of matter, space, and time collapse into a rigid, absolute geometry. In the cosmology of the mythos, existence is split between two fundamental states: the curves of time, where biological life resides, fluid, continuous, bound to linear cause and effect, and the angles of time, rigid fractures in the continuum where laws become irrelevant. The hounds dwell in the angles. This angular space isn't just a metaphor, it operates as an alternate topology, a kind of cosmic infrastructure underlying our own universe. While curved space forms the safe, flowing fabric of reality, angular hyperspace exists as the hidden scaffolding, and something lives in those cracks, something predatory. The original story written by Frank Belknap Long describes how accessing this space is possible, but catastrophically dangerous. Through a formula designed by an ancient Chinese occultist, a chemical compound that transcends mere psychedelics, the protagonist achieves a state of consciousness capable of perceiving past timelines directly. But in doing so, he inadvertently opens his awareness to something else, something watching from the angles. And this is the critical mistake. Once the hounds become aware of an entity that exists within the curves, that entity becomes a target. The prey is now visible in angular space, which means the hunt is inevitable. The hounds use angular hyperspace to traverse not just space, but time itself. They don't travel in the conventional sense. Their reality overlays ours at every intersection, where an angle sharper than 120 degrees exists. Physical corners, structural geometry, even conceptual space is formed in thought or in rituals. Anything that forms a qualifying angularity can be used as an ingress point. This isn't limited to architecture, a folded piece of paper, a shadow cast at the wrong angle, the corner of a mirror, the folds of a polygon. Reality itself is littered with vectors, most of which we pass by every day without realizing their thresholds. Once a breach forms, the manifestation process begins. Thick smoke pours from the angle, not vapor, but something denser. A material seepage from a realm where physical states like gas, liquid, and solid don't apply. What emerges next defies any stable description. Their form is unstable, partially fluid, partially rigid. Observers report hollow telescoping proboscis is used to drain not only bodily fluids, but, according to some interpretations, the energetic structures of consciousness itself. Their bodies fracture the space around them, folding and unfolding in angular cascades that warp the surrounding environment. Witnesses sometimes describe hints of anatomy, limbs, jaws, faces, but these features constantly collapse and reform, as if the entity itself cannot fully resolve into three-dimensional space. Their geometry bends light in impossible ways. Some appear as fragmented outlines, partially transparent, as if failing to cast shadows in the correct direction. Everywhere they pass, they leave behind the infamous blue ichor, a viscous, pus-like fluid that stains more than surfaces. It stains reality. Objects exposed to it often begin to warp. Angles sharpen unnaturally. Reflections distort. Time feels thinner. The air itself seems brittle. Places touched by them become, in effect, permanently haunted by the residue of angular space. And the rules of the hunt are absolute. Once the hounds have locked onto a target, the passage of time becomes irrelevant. They pursue not just the flesh, but the entire existence of the prey, across timelines, reincarnations, even conceptual or astral states. There are accounts both in derivative works and in esoteric interpretations, suggesting that the hounds are capable of tracking the soul or consciousness beyond physical death. Once marked, the quarry ceases to be a being in time, and becomes a fixed point in their perception, an object in angular space. The question of their origin remains open. The name Tindalos doesn't correspond to any physical location. It's a metaphysical coordinate, a point within the angular continuum, a node of intersecting temporal angles, a place without matter, motion, or flow. Only static, frozen geometries sharp enough to slice reality itself. There are interpretations, not fully canon, but increasingly accepted in modern expansions of the mythos, that the hounds represent an extension of the same cosmic forces embodied by entities like Nyarlathotep or Yog-Sothoth. While the outer gods embody the chaos and unknowability of infinite space and time, the hounds could be viewed as localized enforcers of that chaos, mechanisms through which the universe corrects violations of temporal integrity. In other words, they are the predators that hunt curiosity itself. Every attempt to breach the boundaries of time, through forbidden science, ritual, alchemical compounds, or metaphysical projection, is an act of trespass, a violation of the curve, and the hounds are the consequence. There are no protections, no spells, no rituals. Once a being is perceived within the angular realm, the hounds will pursue until nothing remains, and their pursuit is not a chase through space, but through the totality of the prey's existence. Past, present, and future collapse into a single point of consumption. The only defense is never to be seen in the first place. There are entities in the Lovecraftian mythos whose horror comes not from what they do, but from what they are. Atlach-Nacha is one of them, a being whose existence alone represents a slow, inevitable apocalypse, woven strand by strand in total silence, somewhere deep beneath the surface of the world. Its name carries echoes of meaning. Some believe Atlach-Nacha is a distortion of the word arachnid, or perhaps from the Greek arachne, meaning spider. The second half, Nacha, might derive from the German Nacht, night. The name itself feels like a riddle whispered from some primordial language older than any human tongue. And that's exactly what this thing is. A living riddle, spun in silk, suspended between worlds. The descriptions are nightmarishly precise. A creature the size of a crouching man, but bloated, dense, compact, supported by long, grotesquely jointed spider limbs. Between those limbs, something even worse. A face, not fully human, not fully arachnid, just enough of both to shatter the mind trying to make sense of it. A hair-covered mask of doubt, confusion, and intelligence. Small, glinting, malicious eyes that stare with a gaze as cold as stone and as sharp as steel. Atlach-Nacha dwells beneath Mount Vormithadreth, an ancient cursed mountain in the forgotten land of Hyperborea, and its purpose is disturbingly simple. It spends eternity weaving a massive web over the bottomless abyss beneath the mountain, a web meant to bridge two realms that should never meet, the material world and the dreamlands of the Plateau of Leng. No one knows what will happen when the web is complete. Some scholars believe it will trigger the collapse of both worlds into each other, an irreversible fusion of matter and dream, logic and nightmare. Others speculate it might allow something far worse, the release of Abhoth, the source of uncleanliness, trapped for eons in the cavern of archetypes. If the web finishes, the prison opens. And there's no guarantee the web even can be finished. Some occult interpretations suggest that Atlach-Nacha is the embodiment of a cosmic paradox, the god of construction and futility, a builder cursed to weave something that cannot, by its very nature, ever be completed, a structure doomed to fail, or worse, destined to succeed. Atlach-Nacha isn't alone. It commands, or perhaps births, a priesthood, human women marked by the spider who serve as its cult. Over time, they undergo a horrific metamorphosis. Flesh softens, bones stretch, limbs fracture into new joints. Skin hardens into an exoskeleton, until, one day, they're no longer human, no longer anything that should exist. They crawl back to the abyss, to their master, to join the weaving, to become part of the web, both literally and spiritually. The first and only direct account of Atlach-Nacha appears in Clark Ashton Smith's story, The Seven Geeses, where the hunter-lord Ralabar Vuz stumbles upon the spider god in the depths of Vor-Mithadreth. The meeting is almost anticlimactic in its horror. Atlach-Nacha doesn't attack, doesn't threaten, simply acknowledges the presence of the mortal and sends him away, as if a fly had accidentally wandered into the wrong corner of the web. And that's part of the terror. This thing doesn't hate humanity, doesn't even notice it. Its purpose exists on a scale completely unrelated to human meaning. It doesn't devour out of malice. It doesn't build to protect or destroy. It simply weaves, not out of intent, but because weaving is its nature. Later interpretations, including the Pathfinder RPG, reinterpret Atlach-Nacha as an entity neither male nor female, but something beyond gender entirely, a hermaphroditic architect of entropy, the spider god of building and of failure, a contradiction in silk. Its face, whether imagined, misremembered, or partially real, appears in the nightmares of those who know of it, always watching, always calculating, as if asking the same silent question over and over again. Why do you persist in struggling when the web will always catch you? There are entities in the mythos whose existence doesn't represent madness or destruction in the way we usually understand it, but something far worse. Ubbo-Sathla, the blind engine of organic matter, a biological accident that was never supposed to happen, yet somehow does. A malfunction in the fabric of reality that endlessly extrudes life without purpose, without thought. This is what some ancient texts call the unbegotten source, a formless, pulsating mass of gray flesh that existed long before anything remotely resembling life emerged on Earth. No face, no limbs, no mind. Just a porous, swelling surface, constantly secreting globs of primitive organic matter, shapeless, twitching blobs of proto-life that, through endless iterations of mutation and decay, would eventually become everything this planet has ever produced. Half buried within that grotesque mass are the infamous tablets of the Elder Gods, and contrary to what anyone might imagine, these aren't tools or books in any conventional sense. They are compressed structures of information, the operational code of reality itself, blueprints of entropy, molecular decay, the mechanics of how biological matter arises, mutates, breaks down, and collapses back into the same primordial sludge it came from. Trying to read them isn't just dangerous, it's structurally impossible. The human brain isn't designed to comprehend the back-end language of the universe. Any attempt to do so results in the total collapse of identity, of thought, of the illusion that consciousness was ever anything more than a brief anomaly in the blind machinery of flesh. This entity isn't just the beginning of life, it's also the end. The Book of Eibon doesn't frame this as a poetic metaphor. It's cosmic law. Everything that breathes, thinks, or exists came from this mass, and everything will eventually return, because that's how the cycle works. The same biological engine that spits out temporary forms, bacteria, reptiles, mammals, humans, is also programmed to reclaim them, not as punishment, not as judgment, simply because that's the process, and it gets worse. Some interpretations suggest that this thing didn't originate on Earth at all, but was seeded here as one of the countless androgynous seeds expelled from the chaos at the center of the universe. A biological fragment of Azathoth itself, not a gift, not creation in any meaningful sense, just a side effect, a malfunction. a failed attempt by the universe to replicate itself through the dumb, recursive logic of cells, DNA, and mitosis. Life, in this view, isn't miraculous. It's a biochemical accident that never should have happened. Even more disturbing is the connection between this creature and another horror, Abhoth, the source of uncleanliness. Scholars of the mythos have long debated whether these are two distinct entities or simply two expressions of the same process. One as the alpha, the blind extrusion of flesh, the other as the omega, the inevitable decay and collapse of that same matter into filth, rot, and entropy. Some go further, suggesting they are the same machine viewed from different points in time, the beginning as a generator of matter, the end as a cesspool of decomposing organic failure. And if you think the real horror is being devoured by something like this, you're missing the point entirely. The real horror is realizing that you were never anything more than scaffolding for a larger process. You weren't created for a purpose, and you won't be destroyed for one either. You were, and always have been, a temporary arrangement of molecules, a side effect of a machine that doesn't know you exist, doesn't care, and never needed you to be anything more than a flickering shape made of wet carbon and electric noise. This is exactly what happens in the story that bears the creature's name. A man uses the stone of the unbegotten source to push his consciousness backward through the history of the universe, desperate to glimpse the primordial truth, to read the tablets, to understand how the world really works. And as his mind slips further and further back, the structures that support thought begin to fail. Language disintegrates, memory collapses, the concept of self dissolves completely, until there's nothing left but a trembling, shapeless mass of biological matter, quietly reabsorbed into the same pulsating bulk that birthed him at the beginning of everything. Because this isn't the end of life in any poetic sense. It's the end of the illusion that life was ever something separate from the blind machinery of flesh. This isn't a god. It isn't a being. It's a biological engine without a driver, endlessly secreting flesh into temporary forms, only to later reclaim it, dissolve it, and recycle it for the next iteration. And whether you believe it or not, the machine is still running, still breathing, still waiting, because everything that crawled out of the slime will eventually go back to Ubbo-Sathla. When people talk about the gods of the mythos, they usually imagine creatures of destruction, chaos, or madness, entities that tear through reality, that corrupt, devour, or dissolve everything around them. But this one is fundamentally different. It doesn't consume, it doesn't hunt, and it doesn't destroy, because it doesn't need to. Its existence isn't defined by action, but by presence. A presence so overwhelming that the very concept of being perceived by it breaks something fundamental in the human psyche. The name used in the forbidden texts is Yibb-Tstll, though even that is a poor attempt to frame something that exists beyond the limitations of language. Some esoteric traditions suggest that what we're dealing with here isn't a creature in any meaningful sense, but rather a point of convergence in the architecture of the universe, a biological node designed to sustain a very specific boundary. Not a border between countries or planets, but a metaphysical checkpoint separating three layers of existence: reality, the dreamlands, and a third domain. Something nameless, something that sits on the other side of what should be possible. Descriptions of its appearance are inconsistent, fragmented through the madness of those who have glimpsed it. Most accounts agree on the presence of an immense mass of pulsating black flesh, bloated and gelatinous, covered in trembling, pendulous appendages that constantly secrete a viscous fluid. Swarming around this mass is an entire ecosystem of faceless winged parasites, the same entities humans call night gaunts. Often misunderstood as free agents when, in reality, they are directly tethered to this organism, feeding from it like biological peripherals attached to a larger system whose function remains utterly alien. Its head, or rather the region that functions as a head, lacks any coherent structure recognizable as a face, and is instead a glossy paste-like dome saturated with clusters of yellow eyes. These eyes do not blink, do not close, and do not rest. They slide independently across the surface, scanning in every direction simultaneously. Though direction may not even be the right word, since each one appears to track a different point in time. Some may be watching the moment a star is born 1 billion years ago, others the precise second a civilization collapses. while another stares directly at the instant you are breathing right now. This presence never moves in the way that living things move. Instead, it rotates, slowly, continuously, in a mechanical motion that has no apparent beginning or end. This rotation isn't random. It serves a function, a process written deep into the code of the dreamlands themselves, and possibly the physical universe beyond. Some occult scholars suggest that this endless turning is part of a stabilizing mechanism, a pivot upon which certain aspects of reality are balanced. Others believe that its purpose is less benign, that the rotation is part of a scanning process, a constant systematic observation of every possible fracture in the fabric of space and time. And here's where the terror sharpens into something truly unbearable. Some whisper that Yibb-Tstll is more than just a presence stationed in the dreamlands. It is, in fact, the literal shadow cast by Nyarlathotep upon that plane, a fragment of the crawling chaos's consciousness, projected into a form designed exclusively for surveillance. It doesn't act because its purpose was never intervention. It was created, or perhaps emerged, as an instrument of observation, a surveillance node for the multiverse itself. It remembers everything. It catalogs everything. Every fracture in reality, every forbidden crossing between worlds, every unsanctioned manipulation of dream, matter, or memory. Nothing escapes this gaze. But when someone or something pushes too far, when a boundary designed to remain unbroken is crossed, this organism releases what the oldest grimoires refer to only as the blackness. Descriptions of this phenomenon are universally incomplete, often terminated mid-sentence in the surviving records. Those who have witnessed it agree on a few horrifying details. It manifests as a snowfall of black particles, not matter, not energy, but a collapse of both. These flakes don't cover, they erase. Where they fall, existence ceases. Not just the body or the mind, but the memory, the causal history, even the future impact of the object or person affected. Entire regions of space-time fold inward upon themselves, leaving behind no dust, no echoes, not even negative space, just a gap, a blind spot in the fabric of reality that the universe itself no longer recognizes. And even after the blackness dissipates, something always remains, not an object, not a presence, but an absence, a void echo, a scar in the structure of existence where reality permanently forgets how to reconnect its own threads. These scars don't heal, they persist indefinitely, silent monuments to something that was never supposed to happen. For those reckless enough to approach the creature directly, or worse, to attempt contact, the outcome is far worse than annihilation. Direct exposure doesn't simply kill, it saturates the mind with an unfiltered cascade of cosmic information. Every moment in history, every permutation of probability, every equation describing the thermal death of stars, every recursive fold in the multiverse, all of it forced into a nervous system never designed to hold more than a handful of sensory inputs at once. Survivors don't return broken, they return emptied. Their memories fragment into disconnected flashes of data, half-finished sentences, numbers without context, images of stellar implosions, and patterns that seem to describe the curvature of collapsing space. Their bodies continue, their mouths still produce words, their eyes still track movement, but the organizing principle behind those functions, the part that once believed itself to be a person, dissolves into incoherent noise. And this leads to the most devastating realization. This entity isn't a god in any way the term was ever meant to describe. It isn't a being with desires, emotions, or intentions. It's the act of observation, forcibly incarnated, a consequence of a cosmos that achieved self-awareness, and immediately regretted it, a failsafe written into the substrate of the dreamlands and perhaps into the bones of reality itself, a mechanism designed to monitor the integrity of the universe's borders, those that separate reality, dream, and the unimaginable chaos beyond both. It does not forgive violations of those boundaries. It does not punish them either. It simply remembers. And memory is, in the end, the most merciless form of judgment the universe has ever devised. If you've ever wondered what exactly Eihort is, the answer is quite simple and profoundly unpleasant. It's known as the Pale Beast, and it's a great old one created by writer Ramsey Campbell. Its appearance has nothing to do with gigantic tentacles or cyclopean shapes like other gods in the mythos. Eihort is, quite literally, an oval, bloated mass, sickly white, almost translucent, that looks as if it's made of coagulated fat or melted wax. Its body is covered in dozens, sometimes hundreds of eyes that never stop moving. These aren't fixed eyes. They're organic structures that emerge, slide around, sink back into the flesh, and reappear somewhere else. It's as if its skin were a living fabric, constantly generating eyes wherever it needs to look or monitor. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, its body is supported by a cluster of thin, bony legs, almost insect-like in appearance, folding and unfolding as needed. There's no symmetry, no anatomical logic. Sometimes it walks with 3 legs, sometimes with 9, and sometimes it simply drags that bloated mass as if it couldn't care less about moving efficiently. But Eihort isn't just a physical creature. It functions almost like a walking biological factory whose sole purpose is reproduction. But it doesn't reproduce by creating copies of itself. It does it by implanting larvae inside human beings. In other words, to Eihort, we are incubators, biological vessels where its offspring can grow. Within the game universe, Eihort's presence is particularly disturbing in the campaign The Forest of the Thousand Young, an adaptation of the Severn Valley based on Ramsey Campbell's stories. And what this scenario introduces is easily one of the most horrifying concepts in the entire mythos. The idea that the human life cycle itself is nothing more than a biological tool, fully exploited by a creature that has no concept of morality, empathy, or logic. This is where one of the most disturbing cases happens. The story of Kerwin Barclay, a newborn kidnapped by Eihort's cultists and replaced with a creature grown from its larvae. The real Kerwin was trapped deep inside the underground labyrinth, barely surviving under conditions that are physically and mentally beyond anything a human could withstand. Meanwhile, the false Kerwin grew up in the surface world, slowly beginning to show increasingly strange, cold, and unnervingly detached behavior. The kind of behavior that lets you know something is horribly wrong. Under his influence, the children formed a group called the Survivors. On the outside, it looks like an innocent kids club, but in reality, it's something much darker. The initiation process is simple and horrifying. They have to enter the cave beneath Grimsdyke Hill, stand before Eihort, and willingly allow it to implant one of its larvae inside them. From that moment on, they are no longer just children. They become living extensions of Eihort itself. Sure, to anyone else they still look like normal kids, but that's just the disguise. What follows is a spiral of terror that affects both the infected children and anyone unlucky enough to get in their way. One of them, Jamie Upton, manages to escape. He eventually reaches out to the investigators, completely traumatized by what he's witnessed. And it's during the interview that the nightmare becomes undeniable. Jamie suddenly collapses, and something, a larva, squirms out of his ear and slithers away. The kid slowly starts returning to normal, but the damage is done. This isn't hysteria. This isn't imagination. The larvae are real, they're physical, and they are inside people. It gets worse when the investigators realize that the children, and probably some adults, have been secretly studying astronomical phenomena. Officially, it's just a school project about an upcoming meteor shower. In reality, it's part of a ritual tied to a cosmic alignment, one that would allow Eihort to ascend from the depths and emerge into the surface world. This is how the biological infection becomes woven together with a cosmic event that threatens to fundamentally rewrite the rules of reality. And then Eihort begins to invade the dream world too. Victims start having nightmares of a hooded figure whose head is nothing but a mass of living cobwebs. From that tangled mess, a larva launches straight into the dreamer's mouth. But the nightmare doesn't end upon waking. That's when it actually starts. People wake up to find their bodies and bedsheets covered in real larvae. Some desperately try to crawl into their mouths, ears, or any opening they can find. If they succeed, the infection accelerates. If they fail, they scatter and hide somewhere nearby, waiting. The climax happens the night before the meteor shower. The survivors gather in the cave. But this isn't just an entrance. It's a biological node, a living gateway into Eihort's body, which by now no longer feels like a creature, but a sprawling reproductive engine woven through the ground beneath the valley. The labyrinth itself is designed to disorient. Its tunnels warp perception. They loop in on themselves, defy geometry, and leave anyone who enters completely lost and vulnerable, all while Eihort's larvae skitter along the walls, floors, and ceilings. It's deep inside this maze that the investigators finally find the real Kerwin Barclay, or what's left of him. His body is barely functional. His mind is shattered to the point where only fragments of a person remain. And when anyone tries to approach, he attacks like a feral animal. The only way to save him is to knock him unconscious and physically drag him back to the surface. If the investigators fail to stop the ritual, Eihort rises. It drags itself out from the labyrinth, its pale, throbbing mass covered in millions of larvae that spill out like a living plague across the valley. What happens next is nothing short of societal collapse. The infected children become agents of chaos. They set fires. They attack their neighbors. They kill, not for survival, not even out of malice, but because destruction has simply become their instinct. Meanwhile, every infected person begins to physically transform into a smaller version of Eihort itself. What began as a parasitic infection evolves into a full biological takeover. The only ways to stop it are through the use of an elder sign, which forces the larvae to abandon their hosts and severs the biological link to Eihort, or by deploying an incredibly powerful source of light, which forces the creature to retreat temporarily. If successful, Eihort melts back into the earth, vanishing into the rock and flesh of the underground, vowing not to return for another 100 years. But even then, the scars remain. The survivors remember everything. The people who were infected might be physically free, but their minds are permanently broken. The trauma never fades, and if the real Kerwin Barclay is rescued, his family faces an unbearable truth. The boy they got back is no longer the boy they lost. And if they fail, the consequences are far worse. Every single person carrying Eihort's larvae transforms. This isn't just infection, it's mass-scale biological colonization. And from that moment on, the Severn Valley ceases to be part of the human world. It becomes a new ecosystem, one where humanity is no longer at the top of the food chain. Among the most obscure and deeply disturbing entities in the expanded Cthulhu mythos, Zvilpogghua, also known as the Feaster from the Stars, represents something far more terrifying than a simple cosmic predator. This creature is the direct offspring of Tsathoggua, the bloated god of apathy and endless consumption, and a lesser-known being called Shathak, a primordial horror native to the icy wastelands of Yaksh, or Neptune, as humans call it. And yet, despite being the spawn of Tsathoggua, this monster doesn't reflect its father's passivity or indifference. Quite the opposite. Where Tsathoggua waits, dormant, patient, content to let the universe come to it, Zvilpogghua hunts. Its existence is the active inversion of the same cosmic principle, relentless consumption, but driven by predation rather than inertia. It's as if the universe itself produced two versions of the same biological impulse, one that waits and one that chases. The name Feaster from the Stars isn't poetic. It's a job description. This entity doesn't simply consume flesh, nor does it limit itself to biological prey. Ancient manuscripts, forbidden grimoires, and whispering cults suggest that what it feeds upon is far more abstract. Memory fields, temporal continuity, the connective tissue that holds dimensions together. When Zvilpogghua descends upon a world, it leaves more than dead bodies. It leaves gaps, places where the universe forgets itself, where time bends, identities collapse, and reality fractures at the seams. Indigenous folklore in northeastern America knew it by another name, Ubbo-Sathla. The fact that isolated cultures, completely disconnected from the lore of Tsathoggua or the stars of Algol, describe this exact entity isn't a coincidence. It's a testament to the true nature of this creature. Wherever it passes, it leaves a psychic stain, a scar that echoes through genetics, myth, and the collective unconscious of every civilization it brushes against. Its presence lingers as nightmares, strange birth defects, or cursed bloodlines long after its physical form has vanished. Zvilpogghua currently dwells in Eihort, a planet orbiting the accursed star Algol, located deep in the Perseus constellation. But calling Eihort a planet would be an oversimplification. This place functions more like a gravitational scar in the fabric of reality, a dimensional dead zone where matter thins, time distorts, and the rules that govern existence begin to fray. Some texts refer to it as Abhoth, others as Imar, but all descriptions agree. This is not a world meant to sustain life as we understand it. It's a feeding ground, a breeding nest, a dimensional sinkhole perfect for a being like Zvilpogghua to spawn more of itself. Because this entity doesn't merely feed, it breeds. It's the progenitor of Svatlikulp, a creature whose very existence is a declaration of what Zvilpogghua truly represents. Not just the wound, but the infection. The proof that cosmic horror doesn't simply visit worlds. It takes root, it multiplies, it adapts, and it spreads. Descriptions of its anatomy are wildly inconsistent, but there's a general consensus that it takes the form of an armless, winged, toad-like monstrosity standing on two skeletal legs, with a grotesquely elongated rubbery neck and a head, if it can be called that, completely covered in writhing, cephalopodic tentacles. Some occult interpretations suggest that these tentacles aren't even physical in the traditional sense. They are extra-dimensional organs, capable of stretching across the barriers of reality to siphon energy, thoughts, memories, or fragments of the soul itself. There's also an unsettling rumor within certain esoteric circles that the many closed eyes scattered across its grotesque form are more than sensory organs. Each one, should it ever open fully, may serve as a gate, a portal into deeper and far more catastrophic layers of the void. Some whisper that what lies beyond those eyes isn't just worse than Zvilpogghua, it's worse than the concept of existence itself. Summoning this thing, intentionally or otherwise, is always a catastrophic mistake. The Star Beast, its avatar form, occasionally crosses the veil between dimensions, particularly when drawn by rituals rooted in the folklore of Native American tribes or colonial grimoires. But whether the entity appears fully or partially, the outcome remains the same: decay, entropy, biological collapse, and the erasure of coherent reality in the space it occupies. In the grand architecture of the mythos, Zvilpogghua represents a specific terror, not the madness of Nyarlathotep, not the blind chaos of Azathoth, but the inevitable biological horror of being preyed upon by something that doesn't even recognize your right to exist. Something that eats not just what you are, but what you ever were, or could have been. It's a creature that shouldn't exist, not by the rules of biology, physics, or anything that makes sense within this universe. A bloated mass of flesh covered in pulsating suction cup tendrils, 6 monstrous limbs ending in jagged black pincers, and a disgusting elongated proboscis that hangs between clusters of swollen gills. Its head isn't really a head, just a bubbling, shapeless bulge where 3 cold, lifeless fish-like eyes drift aimlessly. You don't even need to see it in person to feel it. Photographs alone radiate a kind of wrongness that sticks to the brain like a disease. Its body feels less like something designed and more like something accumulated, a mistake compiled over eons of failed evolution. And that's not an exaggeration. According to certain forbidden texts, this thing wasn't even born through normal cosmic processes. It was manufactured, if that word even applies, by Zvilpogghua itself. Not through intention or craftsmanship, but as an accidental byproduct of compressing water, temporal distortion, and raw, chaotic matter into a semi-coherent form. The result is unstable at every level. It exists, but it doesn't fully exist here. Parts of it bleed into other dimensions. Parts of it belong to other timelines. Simply being near it can shred reality like wet paper, opening rifts that let things through. Things that don't survive long because they're immediately devoured. It sits, if you can call that hideous crouch sitting, on an ivory throne surrounded by the bones and husks of whatever it's fed on. Once, it was worshipped in the Arctic by ancient monstrous races like the Nofke, whose entire culture revolved around offering flesh to this thing. But the real horror begins when it was dragged out of the ice and into the civilized world. A man named George Rogers, a taxidermist working at Madame Tussauds, somehow transported the creature to London. His plan was simple: feed it, worship it, gain power. Classic mistake. Rhan-Tegoth didn't care. It ate him anyway. It always eats. Friends, enemies, acolytes, strangers, no difference. And that's one of the reasons it never gained a massive cult following like other great old ones. You simply can't trust it. You're not worshipping a god. You're feeding yourself to a biological engine that doesn't care about your existence beyond the fact that you contain calories. To make things worse, this monster is entangled in an endless cold war with other Arctic terrors. Eihort, the White Worm, and Ubbo-Sathla, both of whom fight over the same frozen wastelands, the same desperate delusional cultists, and the same scraps of organic matter unfortunate enough to be within reach. But the most disturbing part isn't what it is. It's the fact that it isn't fully awake. It hibernates in cycles that stretch over millennia, and every once in a while, something, a blood offering, an idiot summoner, or a simple fluctuation in the fabric of reality, pokes it just enough to remind it that the universe still exists. And when that happens, the feeding starts again. Abhoth is one of the most disturbing entities in the entire mythos, not because of malice, not because of cruelty, but because of what it represents. This thing, often called the source of uncleanliness, sits deep beneath the surface of the earth, hidden inside a space that defies any conventional understanding of what a location should be. The infamous Cavern of Archetypes. But this isn't just a cave. It's not just a geological formation tucked away under Mount Vor-Mithridreth in the ancient lands of Hyperborea. It is something fundamentally different. A biomechanical womb, a primordial testing ground where the universe itself throws matter against the wall to see what sticks. The cavern functions as a living blueprint repository, a place where biological patterns are not designed in any rational way, but brute-forced into existence through chaotic, uncontrolled iterations. A leg forms, then an eye, then a proboscis covered in teeth. Sometimes it keeps going, sometimes it collapses into itself, reduced to sludge. In the presence of Abhoth, the line between success and failure doesn't even exist. Creation and decay are the same process. There is no goal, no intended outcome, no final product. The creature itself is a sprawling, gelatinous mass of gray flesh. Its surface is covered in retractable sensory tendrils that constantly writhe, touch, analyze. Not out of curiosity, but out of reflex, like a muscle that flexes without meaning to. Scattered across this obscene bulk are random configurations of body parts, blinking eyes, twitching mandibles, gaping mouths, half-formed limbs. None of them are permanent. The entire organism is in a state of constant flux, constantly birthing malformed life and then reabsorbing it within seconds. But sometimes, something manages to crawl away. Most of the spawn are biologically unsound, collapsing under their own failed geometry before they get far. But every once in a while, a piece escapes. Some half-formed monstrosity drags itself out of the main mass, slithering deep into the surrounding tunnels. These aren't designed creatures. They're accidents that happen to be viable, barely. Some die within minutes, others mutate further, cannibalizing fellow spawn, or anything unfortunate enough to cross their path. And a few, a terrifying few, survive long enough to leave the cavern altogether. That's where the real contamination starts. These escaped fragments are what some occult texts refer to as the seeds of Abhoth, biological anomalies that embed themselves into ecosystems, mutate, hybridize, and sometimes even spawn entirely new species that should never exist. There are theories, especially among the most heretical cults, suggesting that a significant percentage of the strange, malformed cryptids reported throughout history are direct results of Abhoth's escaped progeny. Some go even further, whispering that entire branches of terrestrial evolution might trace their origin to something that slithered out of this cavern millions of years ago. Philosophically, this is where the horror reaches a scale that's hard to process. Abhoth doesn't create life out of intent. It doesn't plan, it doesn't design, it simply outputs, blindly, endlessly, without ever stopping to care whether what it produces is functional, viable, or even coherent. It is the biological embodiment of the universe's indifference, a cosmic factory that never shuts down because the machinery itself doesn't understand the concept of stopping. Its relationship to entities like Shub-Niggurath is particularly disturbing when viewed through this lens. Where Shub-Niggurath represents fertility, growth, and the chaotic abundance of life, Abhoth is the other side of that process. Not death, but degeneration. Not corruption as punishment, but as a natural byproduct of the act of creation itself. In fact, some interpretations suggest that Abhoth is the entropy baked into every creative force in the cosmos, the guarantee that for every successful organism, there will be 1,000 failures, malformed, broken, and screaming into the void for however long they can survive. And yet, despite its grotesque nature, Abhoth is far from mindless. It's capable of telepathic communication. In the tale, The Seven Geeses, it communicates with a human directly, not through language, but through raw psychic transmission. Contact with it is described as deeply traumatic, not because it's hostile, but because the human brain is simply not equipped to process the kind of information this thing radiates. It's not malevolence. It's exposure to the machinery of biological chaos at a scale far beyond what cognition was ever meant to handle. And it's this indifference that becomes the final, most devastating realization. Abhoth doesn't hate you. It doesn't want you dead. It doesn't want anything. It just produces, constantly, blindly, forever. It's not evil. It's not even wrong. It simply is. A reminder that in the grand machinery of the universe, life is disposable, matter is a toy, and failure is just another form of success. And somewhere, buried beneath the layers of rock, flesh, and filth, it's still bubbling. Bokrug, often called the Great Water Lizard, is one of the strangest entities within the mythos. Unlike the grotesque, mind-shattering outer gods or the parasitic Great Old Ones that thrive on chaos and corruption, this creature feels different. It's not a cosmic invader, nor a harbinger of universal entropy. It's territorial, local, almost mundane in its behavior, if anything about a primordial god could ever be called mundane. Physically, it resembles an enormous greenish-blue reptile with webbed feet, a flattened tail designed for swimming, and a cluster of sensitive tendrils hanging from beneath its chin, used perhaps to navigate the dense, murky waters of its domain or perceive things beyond human understanding. Its true scale isn't fully clear. Some texts describe it as a creature the size of a whale. Others speak of a more compact, crocodilian form, 3 or 4 meters long. But as always, size in the mythos isn't an absolute concept. Scale shifts depending on context and on perception. Its role, however, is what truly sets it apart. Bokrug isn't a bringer of madness, nor a corrupter of flesh or thought. It doesn't spread entropy like Abhoth, or force parasitic packs like Eihort. Instead, it embodies a form of cosmic balance, brutal, unforgiving, but undeniably fair. The story of Bokrug revolves around 2 ancient cities, Yibb and Sarnath. Yibb was a city unlike any other in the Dreamlands. Its inhabitants, the Thu'umha, were amphibious, grotesque by human standards, described as green-skinned, bulging-eyed beings with a rubbery texture, but utterly harmless. They lived simple lives, built modest structures, and worshipped Bokrug through dances and water rituals. There was no blood sacrifice, no dark invocations. It was one of the few symbiotic relationships between a species and an eldritch being in the entire mythos. Then came Sarnath, a human city founded nearby. Driven by disgust, xenophobia, and sheer arrogance, the people of Sarnath destroyed Yibb. They massacred the Thu'umha, desecrated their temples, and stole their jade idol of Bokrug. To them, it was nothing more than the primitive icon of a lesser race, a trophy. But here's where the myth takes a turn that feels almost like a warning baked into the fabric of the Dreamlands. Bokrug didn't retaliate immediately. It waited. For 100 years, Sarnath flourished. Its buildings became grander, its riches grew beyond imagination, and every year they celebrated the destruction of Yibb, a reminder of their so-called superiority, until the 100th anniversary. On that night, something stirred in the lake. Witnesses, those few who survived long enough to speak, described a shape rising from the water, dragging with it clouds of mist and unnatural tides. Bokrug emerged, and what followed wasn't just an act of revenge, but an absolute erasure. When the sun rose, the city of Sarnath was gone. No screams, no ruins, no bodies, just a vast empty space where one of the greatest civilizations in the Dreamlands had stood. Its jade idol was returned to the waters, and Yibb was reborn. Some occult scholars argue that Bokrug represents a very specific archetype within the mythos, the concept of natural retribution, not moral justice, not vengeance in the human sense, but the correction of imbalance, a biological function of the Dreamlands itself, like an immune response from the universe when something disrupts the ecosystem too far. And there's something even more fascinating buried in the aftermath of Sarnath's destruction. After the fall, Bokrug didn't return to being just a local god of Yibb. Its worship spread. Humans, yes, the same species that once tried to destroy its followers, began to venerate it in places like Illerkek, not out of love, not out of faith, but out of pure survival-driven respect. Because in the Dreamlands, the gods don't forget, and neither does the water. Well guys, that's all for today. If you enjoyed diving into this twisted corner of the mythos, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves cosmic horror as much as we do. And let me know in the comments, which entity should we explore next? Something tells me it's only going to get weirder from here. See you in the next one.